Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang, secular Discalced Carmelite and professor of theology and philosophy at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. What a treat it is to welcome you to this mini course entitled Exorcism and Deliverance. This has become a very meaningful topic to me, especially over the past few years with the COVID pandemic and everything else going on in the world, how it's affecting culture and the spiritual lives of so many people. So this mini course really is concentrated on a topic that is incredibly vital for spirituality. That is being delivered from demons, from demonic influence, interference, and oppression in our lives. This is something very real. From a Catholic perspective, all of this is incredibly real. The devil is real, demons, they're fallen angels, and they're real. But the good news is that Jesus Christ leads the way in our victory over these powers of darkness that wage war against our souls. So in this first video presentation, I want to look at the roots of a movement in Christianity called monasticism. It has to do with the desert hermits, as they were called, men and women who in the early centuries of Christianity would take leave of the villages, the towns, the cities, and go live in caves out in the desert in order to intensify their spiritual lives, not in a selfish movement, but for the sake of the salvation of souls. So the Carmelite religious order, which I'm a part of as a third order member, has its basis in the monastic movement of silence and solitude and intensified prayer, where life becomes mostly prayer. Most hours of the day are given over to prayer. So there's great sacrifice and self-denial. All the common goods of the world has to offer are given up for the greater spiritual goods and the things more directly related to God. So let us take a look at the monastic roots of the Carmelites and the point of all this in relation to defending the faithful from demonic attacks. This really has a basis in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians chapter 6, where he says, our struggle, our battle is not with flesh and blood, but with the principalities and the powers that rule the darkness and the high places. So monasticism is about a flight from the world at the service of the salvation of the world. It's a very paradoxical thing. Men and women take leave of the world to co-labor in the vineyard of the Lord with Christ. To say with St. Paul, they make up in their bodies what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. It's a kind of missionary contemplation that is fundamentally awake. It involves high degrees of renunciation and what's called asceticism, from the Greek word askesis, that means exercise or training, spiritual exercise as a preparation for martyrdom. Martyrdom from the Greek word martyr, that means witness. In the early church, there were many martyrs. To be a Christian, to be a follower of Christ, was in many places against the law, and you could be put to death for following Christ. And so these men and women would take leave of the world in preparation from an actual martyrdom, in as much as they're already entering into a daily martyrdom of self-denial and what's called mortification in the spiritual life, putting to death all of their disordered appetites and affections and trying to distance themselves from sin and any temptation toward sin. It ends up being a rather nomadic existence, this eagerness for the desert where no one can settle down in it, in search of the city whose foundations are eternal. The monastics, these desert hermits, the monks, and these nuns, as they would eventually be called, would go with Christ beyond the flaming walls of the world. To quote the Roman poet Lucretius, who lived just before the time of Jesus. And then we have, in the 2nd century into the 3rd century, a great contemplative theologian named Origen of Alexandria. And he talks about this very interesting missionary vocation for human beings in which we confront the demons directly. We don't just defend ourselves against them, but we take the offensive approach. And then each demon is overcome by a particular ascetic, a particular monk in the desert, and thereby deprived of its power to disturb other people. This is the understanding of a Carmelite charism and apostolate. It's part of it, that the Carmelites are going to go find out where the demons are hiding, where they're affecting people, and confront them in a kind of vicarious way, representing the people who are victimized, and they're going to go be their defense attorney and their defense operation to keep those powers of darkness away from other people. This is what Origen of Alexandria writes about. This monasticism is then a perpetual spiritual combat in order to be delivered from our captivity to the demons. The monks would bury themselves in the desert to confront Satan and the demon in their final hiding places. So human beings, we can think about this, that we're placed in the world by God to confront the prince of the world and the other demons, these other fallen angels. When we read those early narratives in the book of Genesis, chapter 3, and this voice of the tempter, this Nahash, this serpent, this menacing figure, even figurative, we see there's something real here. So there is something literal. There is Satan. There is the fallen angels. And they fell before the fall of man and woman. And yet we are put here as human beings to confront them, therefore over and over again. The enemy has many strategies of attack. And again, Origen of Alexandria, in one of his homilies on the book of Numbers, says that the reason the Lord has not deprived the devil of his dominion over this world is because there is still need of his works for the battle training and victories of the blessed. This is how we find virtue doing its best work in the midst of great adversity, especially in the spiritual life. And then to quote St. Augustine from his classic work called The City of God, he says that the greater evidence we see of demonic power over these depths on earth, the more inseparably should we cling to the mediator, Christ, by whose power alone we can rise from the deepest depth to the heights of heaven. So this kind of desert solitude in the spiritual life affords the occasion of the supreme battle. So even if most of us listening, myself included, are not called to go out into the desert, to live as these hermits in the desert, we have to find a way to enter it in the spiritual life in any case. And then to quote St. Paul, again from his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, this letter he's writing from prison. He says, finally draw your strength from the Lord and from his mighty power. Put on the armor of God so that you may be able to stand firm against the tactics of the devil. For our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with the principalities, with the powers, with the world rulers of the present darkness, with the evil spirits in the high places. Therefore, put on the armor of God, that you may be able to resist on the evil day, and having done everything, to hold your ground. So stand fast with your loins girded in truth, clothed with righteousness as a breastplate, your feet shod in readiness for the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, hold faith as a shield, to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. With all prayer and supplication, pray at every opportunity in the Spirit. To that end be watchful, with all perseverance and supplication for all the holy ones. Such a powerful text from this great missionary saint who knew a thing or two about the contemplative life and a kind of missionary contemplation at the service of the salvation of souls. So this is just a brief introduction, and let me leave you with this quote as we segue into the second video presentation, concentrating on what some of the Carmelite saints have to say about deliverance and prayers of deliverance and practices of deliverance in the spiritual life. Saint Teresa of Avila says this from her autobiography: "The demons have a tremendous fear of that learning which is accompanied by humility and virtue, and they know they will be discovered and go away with the loss. So let us continue to learn together, to study together the teachings of the Church and the saints and what they did in their lives to overcome these powers of darkness that attempt to eclipse the light of Christ."